Thunder rolled across the empty fields as Silas dragged his suitcase down the dirt road, each step away from the farmhouse carving deeper into the shame he'd carry until his last breath. The gravel crunched beneath worn boots that had walked these same rows for 43 years. Silas Hawthorne pulled his single suitcase behind him, the plastic wheels catching on stones and clumps of dried mud. Each stumble sent a jolt through his arthritic shoulder, but he didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. The bank notice folded in his shirt pocket seemed to burn against his chest with every heartbeat. 62 years on this earth, and all he had to show for it fit in one brown leather case his father had carried to Chicago in 1952. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 generations of Hawthorne sweat soaked into this Iowa soil, and now he was walking away with less than his daddy started with. The corn stood tall on either side of the county road, but it wasn't his anymore. Wouldn't be anyone's for long, probably. The agribusiness company that bought his debt would likely tear down the old farmhouse, level the barn, and turn his 40 acres into another faceless section of industrial agriculture. The thought made his stomach turn, but he kept walking. A rumble of thunder drew his eyes to the darkening sky. Storm clouds gathered in the west, pregnant with rain and electricity. The air felt thick, heavy with the promise of violence. Silas knew that feeling well. It was the same weight that had pressed down on his chest for the past 6 months, ever since Martha's cancer bills started piling up faster than the corn grew. He paused at the bend in the road, where the old oak tree stood sentinel between his property and the Hendersons' place. The tree had been there when his grandfather first broke ground, had weathered every drought, every flood, every storm that rolled across these plains. Silas had carved his initials into its bark when he was 8 years old, right next to the letters J.H. that his father had cut 30 years before that. The suitcase's handle slipped from his sweaty palm, and he let it fall. His legs suddenly felt as heavy as the clouds overhead. This was it, the moment when he stopped being a farmer and became just another old man with nowhere particular to go. The weight of that truth settled on his shoulders like a yoke he'd never learned to carry. Wind picked up, bending the cornstalks and sending dust devils dancing across the empty road. The old oak's branches swayed and creaked, and for a moment Silas thought he heard voices in the rustling leaves. His father's laugh, Martha's gentle humming, the ghost of his own young voice calling out across the fields at harvest time. But ghosts couldn't pay bills or cure cancer or keep a man from losing everything he'd ever loved. The bank had made that clear enough. So he picked up his suitcase and kept walking, even as the first fat raindrops began to fall. The rain started gentle, more mist than water, dampening the dust on Silas's shoulders. He'd made it maybe 100 yards past the oak when the sky opened up properly, releasing sheets of water that turned the dirt road into a slick ribbon of mud. His boots found less purchase with each step, and twice he nearly went down, catching himself on the suitcase handle. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself. Silas thought about the storm cellar back at the farmhouse, the one his grandfather had dug by hand in 1934, the one that had sheltered 3 generations of Hawthorns from nature's fury. But that shelter wasn't his anymore. Nothing was his anymore. He pressed on, rain soaking through his flannel shirt and running down his neck. The county road stretched ahead, empty except for the occasional piece of farm equipment abandoned in the weeds. No one drove these back roads anymore unless they had to. Most folks had moved to town years ago, trading the uncertainty of farming for the steady paycheck of the ethanol plant or the trucking company. A flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, turning everything stark white for a split second. In that moment, Silas saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, about 50 yards behind him, stood a figure in the road. A woman, maybe, or a man in a long coat. But when the darkness returned, the figure was gone, and Silas wondered if the storm had started playing tricks on his eyes. Thunder crashed overhead, so close he felt it in his chest. The storm was moving fast now, and he was caught in the open with nowhere to run. The sensible thing would be to find shelter, maybe in the old Henderson barn up ahead. but sense had abandoned him along with everything else. He kept walking, rain streaming down his face, mixing with tears he hadn't realized he was crying. The wind picked up, turning the rain horizontal and driving it into his face like needles. His flannel shirt clung to his skin, and his boots squelched with each step. The suitcase's wheels had long since given up their fight against the mud, and he was essentially dragging dead weight behind him. But he didn't stop. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant facing the full weight of what he'd lost. Another flash of lightning, and this time he saw the figure clearly. It was Jimmy Henderson, his neighbor's boy, standing in the middle of the road about 30 yards back. Jimmy was barely 18, fresh out of high school, with dreams of escaping to Des Moines or maybe even Chicago. What was he doing out in this storm? "Mr. Hawthorne." Jimmy's voice cut through the wind and rain. "Mr. Hawthorne, wait up." Silas stopped, turning slowly. The boy was running toward him, his own clothes soaked through, his hair plastered to his head. When he reached Silas, he was breathing hard, his young face creased with concern. "Sir, you can't be out in this weather. Lightning's getting bad." Jimmy had to shout to be heard over the storm. "Come on back to our place. Ma's got coffee on, and you can wait it out in the dry." Silas looked at the boy's earnest face, saw the genuine worry there, and felt something crack open in his chest. Kindness. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be on the receiving end of simple human kindness. "I appreciate it, son," Silas said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "But I got somewhere to be." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Jimmy's face fell, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stood there in the driving rain, watching as Silas turned away and continued down the road. The boy's presence lingered in his mind like an echo of conscience, but pride kept his feet moving forward. The lightning was getting closer now, each flash followed almost immediately by thunder. The smart thing, the only thing, would be to take shelter. But Silas had stopped making smart decisions somewhere around the time he'd mortgaged the farm to pay for Martha's treatments. Smart decisions were for men who had something left to lose. He'd made it maybe another quarter-mile when the world exploded. The lightning struck the old oak tree with the sound of God's own hammer hitting an anvil. Silas spun around in time to see the ancient trunk split down the middle, one massive branch crashing to the earth in a shower of sparks and burning leaves. The thunder that followed was deafening, shaking the ground beneath his feet and rattling his teeth. For a moment, everything was silent except for the hiss of rain on hot wood. Then the flames began to lick at the oak's wounded bark, fighting against the downpour. Silas dropped his suitcase and ran back toward the tree, his boots slipping and sliding in the mud. He didn't know what he intended to do. He couldn't save it, couldn't put out a fire that size with nothing but his bare hands, but he ran anyway. When he reached the tree, he fell to his knees in the mud and stared up at the destruction. The oak's trunk was split clean down the middle, revealing the pale heartwood beneath the charred bark. One of the massive branches, the one that had held his and his father's initials, lay twisted on the ground, still smoldering despite the rain. This was it. This was the sign he'd been waiting for without knowing it. The last connection to his past, the final witness to his family's legacy, destroyed in a single moment of celestial violence. The tree that had stood for over a century, that had survived droughts and floods and the Dust Bowl itself, brought down in the span of a heartbeat. Silas pressed his palms into the mud and let the rain wash over him. The tears came then, hot and bitter, mixing with the storm water and running down his face. He cried for Martha, for the farm, for the future he'd never have. He cried for the boy he'd been, carving his initials into that tree bark, believing the world was wide open and waiting for him to claim it. The rain began to ease, the storm moving on toward the east. The oak's flames flickered and died, leaving only the acrid smell of burned wood and the gentle hiss of water on hot ash. Silas remained on his knees, staring at the destruction, until he heard footsteps squelching through the mud behind him. Jimmy Henderson approached slowly, his young face solemn. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the aftermath of the storm, looking at the broken tree. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost reverent. "Granddad used to tell me stories about this tree," he said. "Said it was here when the first settlers came through. Said it had seen everything, good times and bad, birth and death, all of it." Silas looked up at the boy, rain still dripping from his hair. "Well, it won't be seeing anything else now." Jimmy was quiet for a long moment, then he pointed to the tree's trunk. "Look at it, though, Mr. Hawthorne. Really look at it." Silas followed the boy's gaze and saw what he meant. The oak's trunk, though split and charred, still stood. The heartwood was exposed, raw and vulnerable, but the tree hadn't fallen. It stood there like a monument to endurance, scarred but not broken, wounded but not dead. "Fire didn't kill it," Jimmy said quietly. "Might not ever grow leaves again, might not give shade, but it's still standing. Still here." 3 days later, Silas stood in the doorway of Henderson's Auto Repair, his hands stained with motor oil instead of soil for the first time in 4 decades. The job had come through Jimmy's father, who'd heard about Silas's situation and needed an extra pair of hands in the shop. The work was different, engines instead of crops, metal instead of earth, but his hands remembered how to be useful. The old oak was visible from the shop's back window, its split trunk a stark reminder against the sky. Silas found himself looking at it often during his breaks, studying the way the blackened bark had begun to weather, how the heartwood had started to silver in the sun. The tree had become something new, something he'd never seen before, not living in the traditional sense, but not dead either. It existed in a space between states, transformed by violence into something elemental and enduring. "You keep staring at that tree like it's got answers," said Earl Henderson, Jimmy's father, as he wiped his hands on a greasy rag. Earl was a good man, the kind who offered work without asking too many questions, who understood that sometimes a man needed purpose more than pity. "Maybe it does," Silas replied, not taking his eyes off the oak. "Maybe it does." The work kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. He learned the rhythm of the shop, the hiss of the air compressor, the clank of wrenches, the satisfied rumble of an engine turning over after being coaxed back to life. It wasn't farming, but it was honest work, the kind that left visible results at the end of the day. Jimmy stopped by after school most days, helping with small jobs and talking about his plans for the future. The boy had been accepted to Iowa State, planned to study agricultural engineering. He wanted to find ways to help small farmers like Silas compete with the big agribusiness companies. "Won't be easy," Silas told him one afternoon as they worked on a transmission together. "The deck's pretty well stacked against folks like us." "Maybe," Jimmy said, his young face determined. "But that doesn't mean we stop trying. My granddad always said the only real failure is not trying at all." Silas thought about that as he walked home to his small apartment above the diner that evening. The space was tiny compared to the farmhouse, but it was clean and dry, and the rent was something he could manage on his shop wages. He'd taken to eating dinner at the counter downstairs, listening to the conversations of truckers and farmers, the daily rhythm of a small town that knew how to absorb its own wounded. On Friday, exactly 1 week after the storm, Silas drove out to the old oak tree. He'd borrowed Earl's truck, ostensibly to pick up some scrap metal, but really he wanted to see the tree up close in the full light of day. The split trunk looked even more dramatic than he'd remembered, the heartwood pale and smooth where the bark had been stripped away. He walked around the tree slowly, studying the patterns the lightning had carved into the wood. The burn marks spiraled up the trunk like a road map of electricity, and he could see where the sap had bubbled and hardened in the heat. It was beautiful, in its way, a testament to the tree's fierce will to survive even as it was being destroyed. At the base of the tree, he found something that made him catch his breath. New growth, tiny green shoots pushing up through the charred earth around the oak's roots. The tree itself might never bloom again, but it was still nurturing life, still giving something back to the soil that had sustained it for over a century. Silas knelt down and touched one of the small shoots, feeling the delicate strength of new growth between his fingers. This was what he'd been searching for without knowing it, not the restoration of what was lost, but the recognition of what remained. The heartwood, scarred but solid. The roots, deep and persistent. The capacity for new growth, even in the aftermath of destruction. He stood and placed his palm against the oak's split trunk, feeling the rough texture of the burned bark and the smooth reality of the heartwood beneath. The tree had been transformed by forces beyond its control, but it had not been defeated. It stood witness to the truth that survival sometimes meant accepting a different kind of existence, a different way of being useful in the world. As he drove back to town, Silas realized that he hadn't thought about the farm in 3 days. The ache was still there, probably always would be, but it had settled into something more bearable. The oak had taught him that some losses were transformations in disguise, that the end of one story could be the beginning of another. The next morning, he arrived at the shop early and found Jimmy already there, tinkering with a carburetor. The boy looked up when Silas entered, and there was something different in his expression, a kind of eager anticipation that made Silas curious. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jimmy began, "about the deck being stacked against small farmers. What if we could change that? What if we could find a way to help folks like you keep their land?" Silas hung up his jacket and looked at the boy with new interest. "What did you have in mind?" Jimmy's face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from believing the world can be changed. "I've been talking to my professors at the Extension office. They think there might be grants available for sustainable farming initiatives, ways to help small operations compete with the big companies. I know it's probably too late for your place, but maybe we could help others." Silas considered this, feeling something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in months. Hope, maybe. Or just the recognition that his 43 years of farming knowledge didn't have to die with his farm. "You know," he said slowly, "I might have some ideas about that." The old oak tree stood in the distance, its scarred trunk catching the morning light. It would never be the same tree it had been before the storm, but it was still there, still standing, still marking the boundary between one man's past and another's future. And in the end, maybe that was enough. If Silas's story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the quiet strength found in life's most difficult moments, or if it sparked hope in your own journey of starting over, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that transformation often comes disguised as loss. And of course, subscribe to our channel. Here we tell stories that heal, inspire, and prove that resilience lives in the most unlikely places. Until next time, never stop believing in the power of new beginnings.